Picture this nightmare: you are blind. It's midday on July 29th. Channeling censure, but the sun has vanished from the sky. The only thing guiding you through the chaos is the sound of 14,000 men screaming for blood. You're trapped in the middle of a human stampede. Mud sucking at your boots as a wall of farmers crashes into a shield wall of professional soldiers. This is the Battle of Stiklestad. A total solar eclipse has turned the battlefield pitch black, and in that supernatural darkness, a mob of peasants is systematically tearing the King of Norway apart. The violence is intimate and horrific beyond description. There are no arrows flying from a safe distance here. This is hand-to-hand combat in zero visibility. King Olaf Haraldsson is fighting desperately for his life. Surrounded by a ring of enemies 3 layers deep, he swings his sword at shadows, slipping on the gore of his own men. His lungs burn. His arms are heavy. He's dying. Facing him is the Bundetog, the peasant army. These aren't conscripts forced to fight against their will. They are volunteers. They have brought their wood-cutting axes, their boar-hunting spears, and their skinning knives with one goal: regicide. They don't want to capture Olaf and ransom him. They want to erase him from existence. The sheer weight of numbers is crushing the king's defense. The royal mercenaries are being trampled into the mud. Every time Olaf cuts down one attacker, 3 more surge forward from the darkness to take his place. It's a frenzy of violence. The eclipse has stripped away all military order, leaving only a chaotic brawl in the blood-soaked mud. Why? Why are these farmers throwing themselves onto the king's sword? Peasants don't usually hunt kings. They fear them. They bow to them. They pay them taxes and pray for their health. But the men charging up this hill aren't driven by fear or duty. They are driven by pure, unadulterated hatred. Hatred for the man who promised them salvation but gave them torture. To understand this suicide charge into certain death, we have to forget the Saint Olaf of the history books. We need to look at the real man holding that bloody sword. Before the church canonized him as a saint, Olaf was a ruthless Viking raider. He didn't learn to lead men in a cathedral studying scripture. He learned it burning villages in England and France for profit. The man dying in the dark at Stiklestad isn't a martyr yet. He's a warlord reaping exactly what he sowed. Before we dive into how a saint was born from slaughter, make sure you're subscribed to Maproom Battles for more stories where history's brutal. Truths are revealed. 16 years before he died in the mud at Stiklestad, Olaf was already dancing with death. But the setting was dramatically different. Swap the dark Norwegian valley for the gray churning waters of the River Thames in London. The year is 1014. At this point, Viking Age history is reaching a violent crescendo. England is a chaotic war zone being torn apart by competing powers. The Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard has just died suddenly, and the English King Ethelred is desperately trying to claw back his throne. But standing in his way is the Great London Bridge, a seemingly insurmountable obstacle. What was Olaf's role in this chaos? This wasn't the stone tourist attraction we know today. The original London Bridge was a wooden fortress spanning the river, heavily fortified by Danish invaders who controlled London. Armed soldiers lined the parapets, raining down spears and boulders on any ship foolish enough to attempt passage. Underneath, it was an unbreakable chokehold on the city. Enter Olaf Haraldsson. He's roughly 19 years old at this point, a stocky, thick-necked mercenary captain with a growing reputation for creative violence and tactical innovation. King Ethelred offers him a fortune in silver to break the deadly stalemate. A normal commander might have tried to storm the bridge from the riverbanks with siege, ladders. Olaf decides to bring the entire bridge down into the water. This operation showcases the brutal ingenuity that defined Viking warfare tactics. Olaf orders his men to strip the roofs off nearby houses without permission. They lash wattle, wicker, and timber over their longships, creating crude armored shells. These floating tanks look ridiculous to observers, but they're absolutely necessary for survival. The fleet rose straight into the kill zone beneath the bridge. From the fortified structure above, the Danes unleash hell. Heavy stones smash into the wicker roofs with sickening thuds. Spears pin men to the deck planks. The noise is deafening, the splintering of wood mixed with screams, and the roar of the part. Current. But the ships survive the barrage just long enough to reach the massive wooden pilings that support the bridge structure. Olaf doesn't order his men to climb up and fight. He orders them to tie ropes and row away. Thick cables are wrapped securely around the central pillars. Row, he commands. The oars bite deep into the Thames. The current is with them, amplifying the combined horsepower of hundreds of rowing Vikings. The ropes pull taut. The wooden pilings groan under the immense tension. Above them, the Danish defenders suddenly realize the ground is literally moving beneath their feet. With a catastrophic crack that echoes across London, the structural integrity fails. The main spans of London Bridge buckle and collapse into the river, dragging hundreds of soldiers in chain mail down to the muddy bottom. The blockade is cleared. London is retaken. And yes, if that scenario sounds familiar, it's likely the grim historical origin of the children's nursery rhyme, London Bridge, is falling down. This was Olaf Haraldsson in his youth. He wasn't a pious statesman contemplating the nature of the soul. He was a weapon for hire. He spent his teenage years terrorizing the coasts of the Baltic Sea. He was nearly killed in Estonia, raided systematically in Finland, and burned settlements throughout France. By the time he was 20 years old, he'd seen more blood than most slaughterhouse workers see in a lifetime. His motivation during these formative years wasn't religious zeal or divine calling. It was silver. Pure economic gain. He enthusiastically participated in the extraction of the Danegeld, massive protection, payments extorted from the English through organized violence. This was organized crime on a geopolitical scale. You paid the Vikings huge sums to leave, and they used that money to build better ships, recruit more warriors, and come back to demand even more. It was a perfect racket. But a life of piracy and raiding has a ceiling. You can only burn so many villages before you want something permanent, a kingdom, your own. Would you trade chaos for a crown while wintering in Normandy, surrounded by the wealth and power of Duke Richard II? Olaf began to look north with new eyes. He saw his homeland, Norway, fractured and ruled by petty jarls and foreign Danish proxies. He saw a dangerous power vacuum, but he also saw something else in Normandy that would become his most powerful political tool, the church. The dukes of Normandy were Vikings who had converted to Christianity just a few generations earlier, and Olaf noticed how incredibly useful this new god was for consolidating power. The Old Norse paganism was chaotic, decentralized, and deeply personal. Every valley had its own gods, its own temples, its own priests. Christianity was completely different. It was hierarchical. It had a king of kings at the top, God himself, and earthly kings as his appointed deputies on earth. It was a religion of order, control, and divine right. For a man with ambition, Jesus Christ wasn't just a savior of souls. He was the ultimate political partner. Olaf realized with startling clarity that if he wanted to unite Norway under his rule, he couldn't just be another warlord among many. He needed to be God's chosen warlord. The difference was everything. He washed the blood of the Thames off his hands, accepted baptism in Rouen, and set his sails for Norway with a new mission. The pirate was coming home to claim his crown. When Olaf landed back in Norway in 1015, he didn't kiss the ground or seek permission. He conquered it. He declared himself king with absolute authority. But a title is meaningless without submission. To get that submission, he launched one of the most brutal cultural revolutions in European history. This was the forced Christianization of Scandinavia. And Olaf decided that if his people wouldn't kneel willingly for salvation, they would kneel from broken kneecaps. For the independent farmers and chieftains of Norway, this wasn't just a religious change they could adapt to. It was a hostile takeover of their entire way of life. The conflict between Norse paganism and Christianity was the central existential conflict of the age. The old way, the way of Thor and Odin, was woven into the very fabric of daily life. It was about ancestry, nature spirits, and local autonomy. The local jarls were effectively petty kings in their own valleys. They sacrificed to their own gods and followed their own traditional laws passed down through generations. Olaf intended to systematically smash that autonomy. He viewed himself as the Rex Perpetuus, the eternal representative of God on earth. To him, resisting the king was exactly the same as resisting Christ, and the penalty for both was devastation. He traveled from valley to valley with his army, summoning the local farmers to the Thing, the legislative assembly where laws were made. The offer was brutally simple: accept baptism or face the consequences. And the consequences were creative in their cruelty. Saga sources recount that those who refused to convert were not merely fined or imprisoned. They were blinded with hot irons. Their tongues were cut out at the root. Their farms were burned to the bedrock. Their livestock slaughtered. Their families scattered. One specific confrontation captures this clash of civilizations perfectly and reveals Olaf's tactical approach. What happened when faith met force? It took place in the Gudbrandsdal Valley against a powerful local chieftain named Dale Gudbrand. Gudbrand challenged Olaf directly, asking why this invisible white Christ was supposedly superior to their visible, tangible statue of Thor, which stood in the temple, terrifying and majestic. Holding a hammer, Olaf proposed a meeting at sunrise to settle the question. The next morning, as the sun crested the mountains, Olaf pointed dramatically to the light and shouted, "Look, there is my God approaching in all his glory." As the peasants turned instinctively to look at the blinding sun, one of Olaf's soldiers, a massive man named Kolbein the Strong, stepped up silently to part the statue of Thor. With a single shattering blow of his iron club, he smashed the wooden idol into pieces. The result wasn't divine lightning striking them dead. It was vermin, According to the legend, mice, lizards, and snakes poured out of the hollow statue, scrambling over the horrified peasants who'd been worshipping it. The god was nothing but rotting wood and a nest for rats. Olaf turned to the terrified crowd and gave them the ultimatum: make your choice now. Gold for the king and baptism for Christ, or we fight right here. Deprived of their god and surrounded by steel, the entire valley converted on the spot. But this approach of terror and humiliation had a price. While smashing idols terrified the common peasants into submission, it enraged the powerful chieftains who had real military resources. Men like Torhund and Kalv Arneson watched as their ancient rites were stripped away by this foreign religion. They saw Olaf not as a holy man sent by God. They saw him as a tyrant, using a foreign religion as a convenient excuse to seize absolute power. Every tongue Olaf cut out created an entire family sworn to vengeance. Every statue he smashed deepened the reservoir of resentment. Every farm he burned created enemies who would remember. Olaf was successfully building a unified Norway, yes, but he was building it on a foundation of fear and violence. And, as any structural engineer will tell you, fear is a brittle material. It's strong under certain conditions, but if you apply enough pressure in the right place, it doesn't bend gracefully. It snaps. By the late 1020s, the pressure was becoming unbearable. The entire social structure was groaning under the strain, and the enemies Olaf had made were actively looking for a way to break him. They just needed a sponsor with deep pockets to fund the revolution. While Olaf was busy making enemies in every valley of Norway, a shadow was lengthening across the North Sea. It belonged to the most powerful man in Northern Europe, Knut the Great. If Olaf was a sledgehammer, brutal and direct, Knut was a scalpel, precise and, quote, calculating. By 1028, Knut ruled a massive maritime empire encompassing England, Denmark, and parts of Sweden. He was wealthy beyond comprehension, his coffers overflowing with the taxes collected from the richest kingdom in the West, England. And Knut had his calculating eyes fixed on the Norwegian throne. He didn't need to invade Norway with a massive fleet of longships to burn down farmsteads. He understood a fundamental truth about warfare that Olaf had completely missed. How could money defeat swords? It is much cheaper and more effective to buy a man's loyalty than to kill him. Knut launched a campaign of silent conquest that was brilliant in its simplicity. His ships began arriving systematically in Norwegian fjords. But they weren't loaded with berserkers ready for battle. They were loaded with chests of English silver. His agents whispered seductively in the ears of the disgruntled chieftains, men like Tor Hund and Kalv Arneson, who were already seething at Olaf's tyranny. The message was devastatingly simple. Why serve a king who cuts out your tongue and taxes your farm, when you could serve a distant emperor who pays you in silver and lets you rule your own lands as you see fit? It was a master stroke of political warfare. Knut was offering the Norwegian nobility their old freedoms back, packaged with a generous bribe. The effect was devastating and immediate. Olaf's support evaporated overnight like morning fog. When Knut finally sailed his fleet to Norway in 1028 to formally accept the crown, he didn't have to fight a single major battle. The chieftains simply switched sides en masse. They rowed out to meet Knut's ships, not to attack, but to pledge allegiance and collect their silver. This is the cold reality of medieval politics that romantic histories often ignore. Olaf had tried to rule through fear and religious intimidation, but fear requires constant pressure and presence. As soon as a better offer appeared from a richer king, the entire structure collapsed. The Bøndertog, that growing army of peasants and lords that would eventually kill Olaf, wasn't just a spontaneous mob. It was a funded rebellion. The weapons that would eventually cut Olaf down at Stiklestad were sharpened with hatred, but they were paid for with Knut's English silver. Isolated, friendless, and hopelessly outnumbered, Olaf realized the game was up. He couldn't fight the richest man in the world and his own people simultaneously. In a humiliation that must have burned worse than any physical wound, the Viking king was forced to flee his own country like a beggar. He took his young son Magnus, a handful of loyal followers, and escaped east across the Baltic Sea into the vast, snowy plains of Russia. The tyrant had been deposed without a single drop of blood spilled in battle. But Knut had made one critical miscalculation. He let Olaf live, and a wounded animal backed into a corner with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous creature on earth. Olaf fled east, tracing the river routes that Swedish Vikings had carved out centuries earlier for trade. He arrived in Gardariki, the realm of cities known to us today as Kievan Rus. This is a part of Viking Age history, often overshadowed by the dramatic raids in England and France. The Viking world didn't end at the Baltic Sea. It stretched all the way to the Black Sea and beyond. In the Grand Court of Novgorod, Olaf was welcomed not as a beggar or refugee, but as family. The ruler of Rus, Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise, was his brother-in-law through marriage. Here, surrounded by Byzantine silks, warm furs, and the safety of a powerful ally, Olaf could have retired in comfort. Yaroslav generously offered him a governor's position in the distant province of Bulgar. It was a comfortable off-ramp from history. Olaf was in his mid-30s, beaten and exiled. The logical, rational move was to fade quietly into history, grow old in safety, and die in a warm bed. But would he take it? But Olaf was tormented by inner demons. He spent long nights pacing the halls of Novgorod, wrestling with a profound spiritual crisis. He considered abandoning the crown entirely to travel to Jerusalem and become a monk, withdrawing from the world completely. The warrior inside him was dying. The religious fanatic was being born. Then came the dream that would seal his fate. According to the sagas, during a fitful sleep in the Russian winter, a figure of immense light appeared to Olaf in his chamber. It was his predecessor, the legendary King Olaf Tryggvason, or perhaps a manifestation of Christ himself. The accounts vary. The voice didn't offer comfort or an easy way out. It offered a command: you must go back to your kingdom. God has given it to you, and you will not let lesser men take it. Return to Norway, conquer, or die. This was the spark that ignited everything. Olaf woke up with terrifying clarity and certainty. He no longer cared about the impossible odds. He no longer cared that Knut had more gold or that the farmers had more axes. The political calculation was gone, replaced entirely by divine determinism. He believed with absolute conviction he was now an instrument of God's will. He made a decision that showed he knew exactly what was coming. He left his young son Magnus in the safety of Yaroslav's court. He knew with certainty he was marching into a slaughter, and he wanted to ensure his bloodline would survive the fire. with a force of only a few hundred men, mostly loyalists who had fled with him. Plus some Swedish adventurers picked up along the way, Olaf turned his back on the Fön, safety of the east. He began the long, grueling march back across the frozen mountains toward Norway. He wasn't going back to negotiate a power-sharing agreement. He was going back to claim his throne or his halo. The road back to Stiklestad ran through the unforgiving spine of Scandinavia, the Kulin Mountains. It was early summer 1030 when Olaf marched out of the Russian steppes and into Sweden. He didn't return with a legion of disciplined knights or professional soldiers. He returned with a carnival of outcasts. The Swedish king Anon Jacob was technically an ally, but he wasn't suicidal. He refused to declare open war on Knut the Great, the most powerful ruler in the north. Instead, he allowed Olaf to recruit freely within his borders, with a wink and a nod. And who joins a deposed king on a suicide mission to fight the most powerful empire in Nain? The North, not sensible men. Olaf's army was a suicide squad of the 11th century. It was composed of roughly 600 men total. A core group of hardcore loyalists marched at the front, men who would die for him. But the bulk of the force was a collection of forest bandits, highway robbers, and mercenaries looking for plunder. Olaf, in his newfound religious zeal, made a bizarre demand of these cutthroats. They had to be baptized before joining. Imagine the scene: a group of hardened Swedish outlaws, men who had likely slit throats for boots, kneeling by a freezing river to accept Jesus Christ, just so they could get paid to kill Norwegians. It was transactional salvation. As they crossed the treacherous mountain passes descending toward the fatal valley of Verdal, Olaf ordered a rebranding of his ragtag force. What was his strategy? He knew they looked like a band of brigands. He needed them to look like the army of God. He ordered every man to paint a white cross on their round shields and helmets. He gave them a battle cry that would echo off the canyon walls: Fram, Vram, Kristman, Krossmen, Konungsmen, forward, forward, Christmen, crossmen, kingsmen. This wasn't just military decoration. It was sophisticated psychological warfare. Olaf was deliberately framing the coming conflict not as a political dispute over taxes or territory, but as a holy war. By marking his men with the cross, he was declaring that anyone who fought against him was fighting against heaven itself. But omens were everywhere on the march, and they weren't good. In the superstitious mindset of the Viking Age, signs mattered. As the army navigated the treacherous mountain paths, Olaf slipped on ice and fell hard to his knees. In their worldview, a king falling was a sign of a falling kingdom. His foot slipped on wet rock. He went down heavily. A bad sign, Olaf muttered, brushing the snow from his knees. I have fallen. One of his poets, a man named Sigvat, was quick-witted enough to spin the narrative. No, my king, he said. You did not fall. You took a firm hold of the land. It was a clever piece of propaganda, but the mood in the camp was brittle and tense. As they descended from the mountains and the green valleys of Trendelag came into view, the reality of their situation became crystal clear. There were no cheering crowds waiting to welcome their king home. The farms were silent and suspicious. Smoke rose from distant chimney stacks. signaling that the alarm had already been raised. The element of surprise was gone. The peasant army was mobilizing. To Olaf, this march was a divine reclamation. To the people of Trøndelag, it was an invasion by a foreign army. History often falls into the trap of simplifying complex conflicts into king versus rebels. But the 14 Norman waiting at Stiklestad were not rebels in the modern sense. They were the Bondetog, the peasant army, and they represented the largest military force ever assembled in Norway up to that date. Their mobilization was a marvel of pre-modern logistics. There was no standing army, no barracks, and no telegraph system. Instead, they used the budstick. The budstick was a heavy wooden baton, sometimes shaped like an arrow or an axe, spiked with iron. When the alarm was raised, this token was passed from farm to farm by runners. The law was absolute and clear. If the budstick arrived at your door, you dropped your plow immediately, grabbed your weapon, and ran to the assembly point. If you ignored it, you were branded a traitor and outlawed, meaning anyone could kill you without legal consequence. In the summer of 1030, the budstikke flew across the valleys with terrifying speed. Leading this massive host were 3 men. But the 2 most important were Kalv Arneson and Tore Hund. Kalv was a tragic figure in this drama. He had once been Olaf's friend and trusted companion. Now he stood at the head of the army, meant to kill him. Knut the Great had promised him the title of Jarl as a reward, but his motivation was likely more personal self-preservation. He knew exactly what Olaf did to those who crossed him. He'd seen the mutilated bodies. Then there was Tore Hund. If Olaf was the unstoppable force, Tor was the immovable object. Who would win this clash? Tore Hund was a powerful chieftain from the far north. He had a personal blood feud with the king that went beyond politics. Olaf's men had killed his nephew in a previous conflict. Tor didn't want political compromise or negotiation. He wanted revenge served cold. Saga legends tell us that for this battle, Tor donned a strange piece of armor, a reindeer-skin tunic made by the Sami people. It was enchanted with pagan magic to turn aside any steel blade. While Olaf put his faith in the cross and Christ, Tor put his faith in the old sorcery of the north. For the common soldiers, the farmers standing shoulder to shoulder in the mud, motivation was visceral and immediate. They weren't fighting for Knut's empire or abstract political principles. They were fighting for their lives. They remembered the Christianization campaigns. They remembered the smell of burning longhouses. They remembered watching friends and family members tortured. They knew with certainty that if Olaf regained the throne, he would not be merciful. He would punish the entire region with fire and sword. The contrast on the morning of the battle was stark and depressing for Olaf. On the upper slopes stood his 600 men, tired, hungry, and shivering in their foreign armor. They'd marched for weeks through mountains. Below them, filling the valley floor like a flood, were 14, 0 locals. They were well fed. They knew the terrain intimately, and they were fighting on their own land for their own freedom. As the 2 armies locked eyes across the field, the silence must have been suffocating. The Bondetog had raised their banner. It wasn't a cross. It was the symbol of the free farmers united against tyranny. The budstikke had done its work perfectly. The harvest was in, and today they were going to reap a king. Before the screaming started, there was a moment of ritual. Olaf stood before his shivering men. He didn't promise them gold. He had none. He didn't promise them victory. The odds made that an obvious lie. He promised them paradise. If you die, he told them, you die for the King of Heaven. Your souls will be saved. Then the order was given, Skjalborg. This is the defining tactical maneuver of Viking warfare. The men tightened their ranks. The front line locked their round wooden shields together, overlapping rim over rim to create a solid wall of defense. The second line pressed their shields against the backs of the men in front to brace them against the impact. Spears bristled out from the gaps like the spines of a porcupine. It was a human fortress, but a shield wall is only as strong as the nerve of the men holding it, and Olaf's wall was about to be hit by a tsunami. The peasant army didn't march in formation. They surged. As they closed the distance, they shouted their own war cry, Fram, Fram, Bunomin. Forward, forward, farmers. The collision was physics in its ugliest form. Imagine a car crash occurring in slow motion, sustained over hours. What happened when they met? When the 14,000 farmers crashed into the king's line. The front ranks of both sides were crushed by the sheer pressure of the men pushing from behind. Ribs cracked. Lungs collapsed from the compression. Men who lost their footing didn't get back up. They were trampled into the bloody slush, drowning in mud. For the first hour, discipline held on Olaf's side. The king's mercenaries were professional killers who'd fought in multiple campaigns. They knew how to work the shield wall efficiently, deflect the axe blow with the shield boss, stab the spear into the exposed groin or throat. Step back, reset, repeat. They were efficient killing machines, but efficiency has limits when you're outnumbered 4-1. The Bundetog had an endless supply of bodies to throw at the problem. For every peasant that Olaf's men killed, 2 fresh fighters stepped over the corpse, hacking away at the splintering shields with renewed fury. The wooden wall began to chip, then crack, and finally burst open in multiple places. It was around this time that the sky began to change in a way that would terrify everyone. The sun, which had been bright on the snow-capped peaks, started to dim. A sickly twilight washed over the valley like a blanket. The total solar eclipse was beginning. A shadow started to eat the sun. In the confusion as darkness fell, the command structure disintegrated completely. The carefully maintained shield wall dissolved into thousands of individual duels, scattered across the field. Olaf realized he could no longer command from the rear safely. The center was collapsing. The battle was lost unless he did something dramatic. He drew his sword, a weapon named Neitir, and stepped out of the protection of his bodyguards. He wasn't fighting as a general anymore, directing troops from safety. He was fighting as a berserker, seeking personal combat. He cut his way toward the banner of the peasant army, looking desperately for the leaders. He wanted to cut the head off the snake and hope the body would collapse. He spotted them through the gloom, Kalvarnessen and Torhund. They weren't hiding in the rear. They were waiting for him in the center of their army. The king charged into the trap, and the final act of the tragedy began. In the center of the battlefield, the air reeked of iron and sweat. King Olaf finally reached his target, Torhund. This was the moment the saga writers had been waiting for. It wasn't just a fight between 2 men. It was a test of faith versus magic. Olaf swung his sword Neitir with both hands. aiming a killing blow at Tor's shoulder. It should have sliced the chieftain in half. Instead, the blade bounced off. Sparks flew, but there was no blood. It was as if Olaf had struck a stone wall instead of human flesh. Tor Hund laughed. He was wearing the reindeer skin tunic he had commissioned from the Sami sorcerers, believing it made him invulnerable to steel. To the superstitious minds watching in the dim eclipse light, this was terrifying confirmation. The king's holy sword had failed against pagan magic. Could faith defeat sorcery, strike the dog down? Olaf screamed to his marshal, realizing steel wouldn't work against the enchanted armor. Beat him with a club, but it was too late. The king was overextended and isolated. The wolves were circling for the kill. The first blow didn't come from a lord or famous warrior. It came from a commoner whose name barely survived. Thorstein Knaresmed, a simple shipbuilder loyal to the rebels, swung a heavy, wood-cutting axe. It bit deep into Olaf's left leg just above the knee, cutting through muscle and tendon. The king crumbled. This wasn't a hero's injury in some glorious saga. It was a hamstringing. Olaf fell against a large stone, unable to stand, forcing him to look up at his executioners. The second blow came from Tor Hund. Seeing the king down and helpless, the chieftain didn't hesitate or gloat. He drove his spear through Olaf's abdomen, pinning him against the rock like an insect in a collection. It was a gut wound, painful, messy, and inevitably fatal. But the final blow was the cruelest of all. It came from Kalv Arnason, the man who had once been Olaf's friend. The man Olaf had trusted with his life. The man who knew all his secrets. Kalv stepped forward. He raised his sword deliberately, and he struck the left side of Olaf's neck. Leg, belly, neck. 3 blows, 3 betrayals. With that final strike, the perpetual king of Norway went limp. His blood soaked into the moss of the Stiklestad valley, and at that precise moment, as if choreographed by a cosmic director for maximum dramatic effect, the total solar eclipse reached its peak. The world went completely black. The fighting stopped. It didn't taper off gradually. It ceased instantly. The sudden darkness combined with the death of the king sent a shockwave of superstitious terror through both armies. The peasants had won. They had killed the tyrant. But as they stood there in the unnatural night, looking down at the broken body of the man who had tried to save their souls by destroying their bodies, the cheering didn't start. Instead, a heavy, dreadful silence fell over the valley like a shroud. They had killed the king in darkness, but they had the sinking feeling they had just made a terrible mistake that would haunt. In the movies, when the villain dies, the credits roll and everyone goes home satisfied. But history is stranger and more complex than fiction. At Stiklestad, the peasant army won the battle decisively, but Olaf Haraldsson won the war, and he did it while being dead. In the immediate aftermath, Olaf's body was hidden away in a simple shed. The victors expected life to return to normal. They expected the good old days of local freedom and autonomy. Instead, they got buyer's remorse. The new Danish rulers installed by Knut imposed crushing taxes and harsh laws far worse than anything Olaf had ever done. The very farmers who had hacked Olaf to pieces began to look back at his reign with rose-tinted glasses. Maybe he wasn't so bad after all, they whispered to each other. What happened next defies logic. Then the rumors started spreading like wildfire. Blind men claimed they rubbed their eyes with Olaf's blood and could suddenly see. Locals reported strange lights hovering over his grave at night. Crops were growing better near where he died. 1 year after the battle in 1031, a bishop named Grimkel was granted permission to exhume the body. They expected a rotting corpse after a year in the ground. What they found terrified and amazed them. According to the official church records, Olaf looked like he was sleeping peacefully. His skin was pink and flushed with life. His hair and nails had grown, and instead of the overwhelming stench of decay, the grave smelled of roses. The transformation was instant and complete. The tyrant was rebranded as the martyr. The hated king became Saint Olaf. Even his killer, Tor Hund, was swept up in the mass hysteria. Legend tells us that the hard-bitten chieftain, overcome with guilt and religious awe, left Norway to walk barefoot to Jerusalem as penance, never to return. Olaf's son, Magnus the Good, returned from Russia to reclaim the throne. He was welcomed by the very people who had exiled his father and killed him. Norway was finally united, not by Olaf's sword while he lived, but by his ghost after he died. Today, the Nidaros Cathedral in Trondheim, the northernmost medieval cathedral in the world, stands over his burial site. It became the most important pilgrimage destination in all of Northern Europe for centuries. Kings, paupers, and everyone in between made the journey. The axe of Stiklestad, the very weapon that killed him, is now the central symbol on the Norwegian coat of arms, held proudly by the golden lion. Olaf Haraldsson was a brutal man. He was a Viking raider, a torture-happy warlord, and a power-hungry politician who used religion as a tool. But history is rarely written by the nice guys or the moderate voices. It's written by the survivors who need powerful symbols to hold a fragile nation together. Olaf failed to conquer Norway with 14,000 peasants violently against him. But as a saint, he conquered their hearts and minds forever. He became the Rex Perpetuus Norvegiae, the eternal king of Norway. It turns out you can kill a man. You can pierce his leg, his belly, and his neck with cold steel. But you cannot kill a myth. The transformation of Olaf from tyrant to saint reveals something profound about how societies process trauma and create shared narratives. The Norwegians needed to make sense of the civil war that had torn them apart. They needed a story that united rather than divided. The real Olaf, the man who tortured resistors and burned farms, was too complicated and divisive. So they created Saint Olaf, the martyr who died for the faith. This new Olaf could unite everyone. The people who had killed him could be forgiven. The people who had supported him could be vindicated. How does propaganda create saints? This process of myth-making reveals sophisticated medieval propaganda in action. The church played a crucial role. They understood that a Norwegian saint would strengthen Christianity's hold on Scandinavia. A local saint was more powerful than foreign ones. People could visit his tomb, touch his relics, and feel connected to the divine. The miracles attributed to Olaf multiplied rapidly. Every unexplained healing, every good harvest, every victory in battle was credited to Saint Olaf's intercession. Pilgrims began traveling from all over Scandinavia and beyond to visit his shrine. Each pilgrim brought donations. Each donation enriched the church and the city. The economic incentive to promote St. Olaf was massive. Trondheim transformed from a backwater into a major pilgrimage center. The cathedral grew more elaborate with each generation. Kings were crowned there. It became the spiritual heart of Norway. But there's a darker interpretation worth considering. Perhaps the peasants felt genuine guilt. They had killed a king during a solar eclipse. In their worldview, that was clearly a sign from the gods, or God. The psychological trauma of that darkness, that divine judgment, may have been unbearable. Creating the myth of St. Olaf allowed them to process their collective guilt, reframe their actions. We didn't murder a king, they could tell themselves. We accidentally martyred a saint. The speed of the transformation is remarkable. Within a year, public opinion had completely reversed. This suggests organized propaganda rather than spontaneous religious fervor. Someone, likely the church hierarchy working with Magnus's supporters, deliberately promoted the saint narrative. They had the body exhumed publicly. They certified the miracles. They commissioned sagas and poems. They created a new history that served current political needs. This pattern repeats throughout history. Societies constantly rewrite their past to justify their present. The American founding fathers were transformed from wealthy slaveholders into prophets of liberty. Confederate generals became noble defenders of states' rights rather than slaveholders. Joan of Arc went from heretic burned at the stake to national saint of France. The mechanism is always similar. Select certain facts, ignore others. Add miracles or virtues. Remove uncomfortable truths. Within a few generations, the myth becomes the truth in popular consciousness. The real person is forgotten. Only the symbol remains. Olaf's transformation teaches us about the power of religious authority to shape historical memory. The church controlled literacy, controlled education, controlled the official records. They decided which stories were preserved and which were forgotten. But there's also something genuinely moving about the story. The peasants who killed Olaf weren't evil. They were defending their freedom against what they perceived as tyranny. Olaf wasn't pure evil either. He genuinely believed he was saving souls, even if his methods were brutal. The tragedy is that both sides had legitimate grievances and neither could find compromise. What modern lessons can we extract? The Battle of Stiklestad offers profound lessons for understanding modern conflicts. First, it demonstrates the danger of imposing change through violence. Olaf's forced Christianization created enemies faster than he could subdue them. When you try to change people's fundamental beliefs through terror, you don't create converts, you create future rebels. We see this pattern in modern history. The Soviet attempt to eliminate religion through force failed. The American attempt to impose democracy in Iraq and Afghanistan through military occupation created insurgency. The Taliban tried to impose fundamentalist Islam through terror and was overthrown. Force can control behavior temporarily, but it can't change hearts and minds. Second, the story illustrates the power of economic warfare. Connaught didn't defeat Olaf through superior military force. He defeated him by offering better terms to the Norwegian nobility. He bought loyalty that Olaf tried to compel. This lesson is relevant today. Economic sanctions, trade agreements, and financial incentives are often more effective than military force. China's Belt and Road Initiative is modern economic conquest. American sanctions are economic warfare. Corporations moving production to cheap labor countries is economic power projection. Third, Stiklestad shows how exile can be a fatal mistake. Canute should have killed Olaf or kept him prisoner. By allowing him to flee to Russia, Canute gave him time to regroup and return. This pattern repeats. Napoleon returned from Elba. Lenin returned from Switzerland. Khomeini returned from France. Exiled leaders often return more dangerous than before because they've had time to refine their message and build mystique. Fourth, the battle demonstrates the limitations of military superiority against motivated locals. Olaf had professional mercenaries. The peasants had farmers with axes, but the peasants knew the terrain, outnumbered him dramatically, and were fighting for their homes. We see this in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and countless other conflicts. Local knowledge and motivation can overcome professional military superiority. Fifth, the transformation of Olaf into a saint reveals how societies use mythology to process trauma and create unity. After a civil war, societies need reconciliation narratives. America created the Lost Cause mythology after the Civil War to reunify the country, though it perpetuated racism. South Africa used Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. Norway created St. Olaf. These narratives aren't historically accurate, but they serve a social function of allowing former enemies to coexist. Sixth, the story shows the power of religious authority to control historical narrative. The medieval church decided which version of history survived. Today, different institutions fill that role. Media companies, social media algorithms, educational systems, governments. Whoever controls the platforms that preserve and distribute information controls. Historical memory. How does this apply to you? The eclipse at Stiklestad wasn't just atmospheric drama. It was a psychological weapon more powerful than any sword. In an age where people believed celestial events were divine messages, the timing was catastrophic for both sides. For Olaf's men, the darkness confirmed their worst fears. God was withdrawing his favor. For the peasants, it suggested they might be fighting against heaven itself. This reveals the importance of optics and symbolism in conflict. Modern political and military leaders understand this deeply. The location of treaty signings, the timing of announcements, the visual staging of events, all are carefully choreographed. Putin's staged photos showing strength, Trump's walks to churches, Biden's speeches with specific backdrops. Every image is propaganda. The Bootstikke, the wooden baton that mobilized the peasant army, was an ingenious technology for its time. It solved the coordination problem without telecommunications. The modern equivalent is social media organizing protests, hashtags mobilizing movements, and viral content spreading ideas instantly. The mechanism is different, but the function is identical. Rapid mobilization of dispersed populations. Thor Hund's enchanted reindeer skin represents the universal human desire for protection against overwhelming force, whether it's faith in God, faith in technology, or faith in ideology. Humans need to believe something protects them when facing death. Modern soldiers wear body armor and trust in air support. Ancient warriors wore amulets and trusted in gods. The psychological function is the same. Calv Arneson's betrayal embodies the tragedy of civil wars. Friends become enemies. Brothers fight brothers. The bitterness is worse than conflicts with foreigners because it involves violated trust. We see this in the American Civil War, the Spanish Civil War, the Syrian Civil War. These conflicts leave scars that last generations. Olaf's decision to leave his son Magnus in Russia before marching to his death shows strategic thinking, even in religious zeal. He ensured regime survival, even if he personally died. Modern leaders do this through succession planning, institutional structures, and ideological indoctrination. The individual may die, but the system survives. The saga poets spinning Olaf's fall as taking hold of the land demonstrates the power of framing. Politicians and PR professionals do this constantly, reframing defeats as victories, scandals as misunderstandings, failures as learning opportunities. The same facts can support completely different narratives depending on framing. The peasant's remorse after killing Olaf illustrates a profound psychological truth. People often don't know what they want until they get it. The grass isn't always greener. Revolution can make things worse. Brexit voters experiencing buyer's remorse. Populist leaders elected to shake things up, causing chaos. The devil you know versus the devil you don't. The question isn't whether change is needed, but whether you have a better alternative. Ready? What's your biggest takeaway from this battle? Thank you for joining me on Maproom Battles for this deep dive into one of history's most dramatic transformations from tyrant to saint. If you enjoyed discovering how a hated king became a national symbol through death and propaganda, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories where the truth is stranger than legend. I want to hear from you. Was Olaf a brutal tyrant who got what he deserved? Or a visionary trying to modernize Norway through harsh but necessary methods? And do you think the peasants were right to rebel? Or did they make a mistake they regretted? Share your thoughts in the comments. This battle raises profound questions about the use of force to impose beliefs, the power of economic warfare, and how societies rewrite history to serve current needs. The lessons of Stiklestad echo through time into our present moment. The location of the battle is still there in Norway. You can visit the stone where Olaf allegedly fell. You can see the battlefield. But what you're really seeing is a stage where myth and history merged. The physical ground matters less than the story that grew from it. That's the real power of Stiklestad, not what happened in the darkness of the eclipse, but what people chose to believe happened. The transformation of Olaf reveals how flexible historical truth is. Facts are stubborn things, but narratives are fluid. Give people a reason to reinterpret events, and they will. The church needed a Norwegian saint. Magnus needed legitimacy. The peasants needed absolution. So Olaf the tyrant became Olaf the saint. Modern societies do this constantly. We create founding myths that ignore uncomfortable truths. We celebrate national heroes while forgetting their crimes. We tell simplified stories that unite us even when they distort reality. This isn't necessarily evil. Societies need shared narratives to function, but we should be aware we're doing it. The real lesson of Stiklestad isn't about medieval Norway. It's about how power, religion, guilt, and propaganda combine to create the stories we tell ourselves. Every nation has its Stiklestad, a traumatic event that was later reframed into a unifying myth. Every culture has its Saint Olaf, a complicated figure simplified into a symbol. The solar eclipse that darkened the battlefield wasn't a miracle. It was astronomy. But the psychological impact was real. Sometimes the meaning we assign to events matters more than the events themselves. That's both the power and danger of mythology. It can unite and heal. It can also blind us to truth. Until next time, remember, history isn't just what happened. It's what we choose to remember and how we choose to tell it. The sword that killed Olaf is now on Norway's flag. The axe that felled a tyrant became the symbol of a nation. That transformation, from weapon to symbol, from killer to saint, is the real magic of history. Stay curious, stay critical, and keep questioning the stories we inherit. The myths we believe shape the future we create.